God's plan is centered in Jesus, and God's plan is active in the world through the Holy Spirit. When I say Holy Spirit, many of you guys are like, what do you mean Holy Spirit? That sounds kind of creepy, kind of, strange. Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is not a ghost. The Holy Spirit is God himself. And what he does and how he's active and how he's at work in the world. The Holy Spirit is who God is when he's up to something here on earth. And the Holy Spirit is not confined to church or to when we gather together. The Holy Spirit is active in the world whenever I see something good happening. Whether a Christian is doing it or not, I go, the Holy Spirit could be at work here. And so when I see these good things, I want to support it. I want to try to understand it. I want to bless it because I know God is up to something. God's plan is centered in Jesus. God's plan is active in the world through the Holy Spirit. And God's plan is inclusive of the people who are down and out. God's plan is inclusive of the poor. God's plan is inclusive of all ethnicities. God's plan is inclusive. And I love this poem that Emily did. God's plan is inclusive of women. See, Christianity is not just for the suburban middle class. And for those of you who are not white, Christianity is not just a white man's religion. Christianity is not designed to keep us oppressed. If you look at the history of the world, the breakthroughs, the things that have liberated people have come from Christians. Women couldn't vote, couldn't do anything because of Christian women fighting for women's rights. That came to pass. The slave trade, the abolition against the slave trade started by Christians. And so we see here Luke focusing on not the men, but the women. A lot of times we push women to the side, and I'm a perpetrator of this. For years, I started realizing that I started looking at people for leadership. I started looking for looking for men and not women. My words always betray me because I always say he, him. It's never about a woman. I don't know. I couldn't think of women that I really admired. And so I had to go through this whole transformation of digging into great women, women who have done things. And it's biblical because Jesus had these women followers, which was it was a breakthrough at the time. These women followers who were loyal to Jesus. If you look in Luke 8:1-3, the women were traveling with him, supporting his needs and also learning from him. They were with him when he died at his death. They were with him when they buried him. And now in this passage, they're with him trying to anoint his body. While the men were off in a room locked up, the women were bold enough to be aligned and loyal to Jesus. And so they're going to anoint this body. And suddenly the stone is rolled away. There are two angels speaking to them. He's not here. Why do you seek the living among the dead? And I bet for even the women, these words were nonsense. And it says then they remembered his words. And maybe when Jesus first said it, they thought it was like a metaphor or, maybe he's kind of trying to do some weird allegory or fairy tale. Or maybe they weren't even listening at all. I know sometimes I don't listen to everything people say. You know how it is. People are talking and you kind of zone out. Like, huh? What? Sometimes that happens with Yvette. And it's just like, I don't know. Could you repeat that again? It says they remembered his words, and that's when they got this conviction that he's not here. He's risen. And so they got this conviction, and they had to tell the story. The angel said, go, tell the other disciples. They went and ran to tell them. And it says the disciples, these guys who were close to Jesus, they should have known better. It says they dismissed it as nonsense. And I think they dismissed it as nonsense because they were totally skeptical by this time. They were probably thinking, man, we followed this guy and what a big letdown. It's like all the people that follow McCain. It's like, oh, man, it's a big letdown. They followed him. They were in disbelief. They were dejected. They were disappointed. And so they didn't even want to hear Jesus is risen. Come on, we saw it all happen. So I think they dismissed these words as nonsense because they were skeptical. But I also think they dismissed these words as nonsense because they were just totally chauvinistic. See, back in those days, women were only seen as housekeepers and bearers of children. And so when you look at that word nonsense, it means an idle tale of a babbling, insane, and fevered man. So they were dismissing the women's words because it was like, oh, it's just women getting excited about stuff. You know how guys be doing. They were so saturated, so embracing of the culture that they were in that they dismissed the women's words as nonsense. And let me give you an example of how much they degraded women back then. In one of the extra biblical books, it says, better is the wickedness of a man than a woman who does good. It is woman who brings shame and disgrace. In one of the rabbinic books, it says that a Jewish man was told to pray 3 benedictions each day, including one in which he thanked God that he was not made a woman. Rabbis were not to be seen in public with women. And a woman's testimony was inadmissible in those contexts. And so they dismissed these words. They said, your testimony, it don't really count. I'm not going to believe that. And you see Peter. Peter runs from the tomb. He runs to the tomb. He looks at the clothes. He sees the empty tomb, and he wonders what has happened. He says, something's going on here. He didn't totally believe it. I think he still was thinking it was nonsense. But he's saying, what's going on? How could Jesus, man, we followed you. You was our dog. We gave up everything. And then you're going to give this privilege of telling the world that you rose from the dead first to the women? That's right. Somebody catching on. Peter is saying, this is nonsense. But Jesus' resurrection makes sense out of the nonsense.